Hello, I'm Willie Clemmer and welcome to Citizen Kane Analysis. Today I'll be examining the marriage just like any other marriage scene where the deterioration of Mr. Kane's marriage is shown. Now this scene was just like any other scene in Citizen Kane, artfully created, giving the viewer a true understanding of the struggles of Mr. Kane's marriage. To get started, let's talk about mise en scène. Mise en scène is the arrangement of everything in the frame. In good films, everything has a reason. One of the most obvious aspects of mise en scène is the placement of the actors and actresses. As the scene changes from the interview with Leland to Mr. and Mrs. Kane sitting down to eat, you notice right away that the husband and wife sit down next to each other. They are newlyweds, happy and in love. However, as it cuts from interaction to interaction, the couple steadily grow farther apart, sitting at opposite ends of the table, as far away from each other as they can be. And by the very end, they are completely disengaged and are both reading newspapers. Here, if you look closely, you can see that Mrs. Kane is not reading her husband's newspaper, showing even further that their marriage has fallen apart. This scene was able to fit the rule of thirds partly because of the movement of the camera, but I'll get to that later. Leland is positioned so that he is right on the line of the third section and looking into open space to the right. This gives the viewer a sense of direction. He is talking to somebody off-screen on the right side. Without Leland positioned as he is, the shot would seem awkward, and it would be much harder for the viewer to understand the details of the conversation. We see the same positioning throughout the rest of the scene. When there are close-ups of Mr. and Mrs. Kane talking, they look the same. The actor or actress slightly to one side, looking into open space in the direction of the person they are talking to. That's enough of the rule of thirds for a little bit, but I'll get back to it soon. Let's talk about cinematography. Now, there's not a lot of movement in this scene, except for the movement of lips. This sequence is the only time where a character actually moves. Mr. Kane's movement through the room seems normal, so it is fair to assume that a normal lens was used in this scene at least. This makes sense because the importance of the scene is more on the conversation of Mr. and Mrs. Kane rather than any special effect that could come from how the movements are represented. Depth of field changes slightly throughout the scene. At the beginning and end of the scene, when Leland is being interviewed, the depth of field is very shallow. This brings extra attention only to Leland and not to his surroundings, so that the viewer pays close attention to what he is saying. In this sequence, however, the depth of field is considerably deeper, but it is still slightly shallow. Mr. and Mrs. Kane are in focus, but their surroundings are slightly out of focus. Now on to lighting. There is nothing too exciting here, but it is still worth taking into account. Here there is significant backlighting, bringing further attention to Leland. Here there is also backlighting coming from the windows, but there's also direct light shining onto Mr. and Mrs. Kane's faces. This puts them in clearer focus. Now remember when I said that this scene obeyed the rule of thirds? Well, that was partly due to the movement of the camera. Well, it's true, and a prime example of this is when it first cuts away from Leland to Mr. and Mrs. Kane. The clip starts out in balance, with Mrs. Kane slightly off-center, but as Mr. Kane enters the frame, the camera begins to pan to the left as well as zoom. It does this not only so the viewers can see the interaction to come in more detail, but also so that when the camera stops moving and zooming, Mr. and Mrs. Kane are exactly in the right spot to obey the rule of thirds. Now let's move on to sound, which plays a significant role in this scene. As Leland is being interviewed, the music is slow and dramatic, but shortly before it begins to fade, the music changes to be darker, ringing bells, very dramatic and spooky. This change foreshadows to the viewer that what they are about to see does not end happy. There are 6 different interactions between Mr. and Mrs. Kane, and for the first 4, there is different sound for each that portrays the mood of the conversation. During the first interaction, the music is slow, dramatic, and slightly romantic, just like Mr. and Mrs. Kane are acting. In the second clip, the music changes to be much quicker, almost frantic, and playful, much as Mr. and Mrs. Kane are acting. In the next 4 interactions, as Mr. and Mrs. Kane's conversations get more and more heated and unhappy, the music follows suit and becomes more dramatic, deeper, strained, and intense. Towards the very end, it brings about a feeling of foreboding in the listener. Enough with that sad stuff. Now on to editing, where I'm joined by the one and only Riley P.
Howdy, folks. Alright. There are 3 types of cuts in this scene.
Basic switches from one thing to another, not very special, just simple. Fades where one image slowly changes into another, and this transition where what looked like windows pass quickly across the screen.
Now in the example shown, the fade allows the viewer to see Leland's feelings towards what is coming onto the screen while they are seeing it, which brings the viewer a better understanding of what is about to come.
The windows moving transition has a very different meaning to the viewer. It shows that the time has been passed between the conversation that just happened and the one they are about to see. Without this understanding, the viewer would be left confused and questioning what exactly is going on.
There is also a parallel action. Leland is being interviewed, and Mr. and Mrs. Kane are having a series of breakfasts. Combined together, the viewer understands what Leland is describing to a reporter, what Mr. and Mrs. Kane's marriage is like.
Now, finally, onto narrative and genre.
Okay, Citizen Kane, the movie from which the clip Willard and I have been talking about, is an American drama that was very political, and it is based partially on the life of William Randolph Hearst.
Within the narrative of the story, this clip provided the viewer and the reporter in the film with an understanding of Charles Kane's personality. Most importantly, it shows his desire for love, but his inability to give much back. The scene is not chronological, but it fits into the film as a whole chronologically.
Non-diegetic elements of the narrative include the music and the transitions between Mr. and Mrs. Kane's interactions. The camera is the primary narrator, but Leland is also the third-person diegetic narrator for a short time.
This concludes Citizen Kane Analysis. Thank you for your time, and come back soon!